A duchess by accident began with a nap on the night train, but when she woke at dawn beside the Duke of Haverton, he made a proposal that would change them both forever. She thought she had ruined her reputation by falling asleep against a stranger's shoulder, but discovered she had awakened the heart of a man who had sworn never to love again. The night train sliced through the darkness like a blade through velvet, carrying more than passengers. It carried the weight of choices that could no longer be undone. Leora Hensley stepped aboard with luggage too light for someone claiming to start over. The real burden she carried was invisible. Weeks of accumulated pressure, decisions made from desperation rather than desire, and the persistent ache that her life was always determined by forces larger than herself. The narrow carriage reeked of coal smoke, worn leather, and the expensive perfumes of those who traveled without fear of their destination. Gas lamps cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock the passengers' attempts at composure. Leora found her assigned seat and tried to convince herself this journey was merely transportation, not escape. A few hours until dawn, she told herself. Nothing more than that. But her body refused to cooperate with the narrative she repeated like a prayer. The rhythmic sway of the rails conquered her vigilance, and exhaustion claimed the rest. When she woke, she realized she had fallen asleep against someone, leaning into a shoulder that was too solid, too still to be accidental. Embarrassment flooded her before full consciousness returned. She pulled away quickly, mumbling an apology that died when she met the attentive gaze of the man beside her. He didn't seem surprised. He simply watched as if confirming a hypothesis he'd been testing. The dim light revealed aristocratic features, perfectly tailored clothing, and a posture that didn't request space. It commanded it. When he spoke, his voice was low, precise, controlled. Each word felt deliberate, as though he rationed speech like a precious commodity. He knew who she was. He didn't ask if she was well. He asked where she thought she was going. "Miss Hensley," he said, and the way he pronounced her name made it sound like a verdict. "I believe there are matters we should discuss before this train reaches its destination." Leora's spine stiffened. No one on this train should know her name. She had purchased her ticket under careful anonymity, chosen the least conspicuous carriage, avoided eye contact with other passengers. Yet this stranger spoke as though they had an appointment. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Dorian Westmere," he replied without offering his hand. "Duke of Haverton. And you, Miss Hensley, are exactly where you're supposed to be." The title fell between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to touch every corner of the small compartment. Leora had heard the name whispered in drawing rooms and discussed in newspapers. The young duke who had inherited more than estates, who wielded influence like others wielded walking sticks. She tried to shrink into invisibility, but his presence wouldn't allow it. "I purchased my own ticket," she said carefully. "I chose my own seat. Whatever you think you know." "Your family's debts," he interrupted, his tone neither cruel nor kind, simply factual. "The mounting pressure from creditors. The difficult choices you've been forced to consider. The reason you're on this particular train at this particular time, carrying a bag barely heavy enough to suggest permanence." Each word struck like a physical blow. Leora's hands clenched in her lap, her careful composure threatening to crack. "How could you possibly?" "I know because I made it my business to know." He turned slightly in his seat to face her more directly. "Your name was provided to me as a solution to an ancient problem. The need for an appropriate companion, someone educated, unknown enough to avoid questions, and—" He paused, and something almost like regret flickered across his features. "And disposable enough to cause no lasting complications." The word, disposable, hung in the air like smoke. Leora felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not just anger, but a crystalline clarity that cut through weeks of confusion and self-doubt. "I see." Her voice had gone very quiet, very calm. "And you assumed I would simply agree to this arrangement?" "I assumed you would recognize the practicality of the situation." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. "Your current circumstances leave you with limited options. I'm offering you an alternative that serves us both." Leora stared at the papers without taking them. What kind of alternative? Temporary companionship. 6 months, perhaps a year. You would accompany me to necessary social functions, maintain an appropriate presence, and ask no questions about matters that don't concern you. In exchange, certain financial pressures affecting your family would disappear. And at the end of this arrangement, you would be compensated for your time and released from any obligations. What you choose to do afterward would be entirely your decision. The train swayed around a curve, and Leora felt the world tilting in ways that had nothing to do with the rails. Everything he said was reasonable, practical, even generous. And yet something in his careful words, in the way he presented choices as inevitable, made her want to flee into the night. "No," she said simply. For the first time, Dorian's composure seemed to crack slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Leora turned to face him fully, her fear transforming into something harder, more dangerous. "I don't know how you learned about my circumstances, and I don't care what arrangements others may have made on my behalf. I am not a problem to be solved or a convenience to be purchased. Miss Hensley. Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I suggest you find another solution to your ancient problem, because I am not it." The silence that followed stretched like a wire being drawn to its breaking point. Outside the windows, the dark countryside rushed past, indifferent to the small drama playing out in the narrow compartment. The gas lamps flickered, casting shifting shadows across Dorian's face. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new quality, something that might have been respect or perhaps simply surprise. "Very well," he said. "But before you make your final decision, there's something else you should know." Leora waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The person who provided your name to me isn't finished with you, Miss Hensley. Refusing my offer doesn't make you free. It simply makes you vulnerable." And in that moment, Leora realized the train wasn't taking her toward freedom at all. It was carrying her deeper into a web she was only beginning to understand. The train's whistle pierced the night like a scream, and Leora felt the sound echo in her chest. Dorian's words hung between them, not a threat but something worse, a statement of fact delivered with surgical precision. "Explain," she said, though part of her already understood more than she wanted to. Dorian shifted slightly, and the movement seemed to bring shadows with it. "3 weeks ago, a man approached my estate manager with a proposition. He claimed to represent certain interests that had acquired information about your family's circumstances. Financial records, correspondence, documentation of choices made under pressure." He paused, studying her face. "He suggested that this information might prove valuable to the right buyer." Leora's stomach turned. She thought of her father's pride, her mother's carefully maintained dignity, her younger sister's hopes for a respectable marriage. All of it balanced on a foundation more fragile than anyone outside their household knew. What kind of information? The sort that destroys reputations slowly but thoroughly. Nothing dramatic enough to create sympathy, but damaging enough to ensure social exile. His voice remained steady, clinical. "Your father's gambling debts to men whose names appear in no respectable ledgers. Your mother's creative approaches to maintaining appearances. The methods used to secure your sister's education." Each revelation struck like a physical blow. Leora closed her eyes, trying to steady herself against the train's relentless motion. "And you? What did you tell this man?" "That I might have a use for such leverage myself." The honesty of it was almost worse than a lie would have been. Leora opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Calculating, yes, but with an undercurrent of something that might have been regret. "So you're no different from him." "I'm exactly different from him." The sharpness in his voice cut through her accusation. "He seeks to destroy for profit. I seek to preserve for necessity." "Whose necessity?" Dorian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the window where darkness rushed past like spilled ink. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested old wounds never quite healed. "My late wife died 3 years ago. Sarah." The name seemed to cost him something to speak. "Since then, certain expectations have been placed upon me. The need to remarry, to secure the succession, to fulfill social obligations that seemed designed to parade my availability before every eligible woman in England." Leora heard the exhaustion beneath his controlled tone. "And you find this distasteful?" "I find it impossible." His hands, which had been perfectly still, finally moved, a slight tightening of fingers that suggested volumes. "I have no intention of remarrying. None. But stating this directly would create complications. Political alliances that depend on the possibility of union. Financial arrangements that assume future heirs. The careful balance of power that has kept my holdings secure. So you need a shield." "I need someone who can accompany me to necessary functions, deflect unwanted attention, and allow me to fulfill social obligations without encouraging genuine expectations." He turned back to her. "Someone intelligent enough to understand the role, dignified enough to play it convincingly, and temporary enough that no real attachment will form." The train lurched slightly and Leora gripped the edge of her seat. Everything he described made perfect sense from his perspective. A bloodless arrangement that solved problems for both parties. And yet something in her recoiled from the cold precision of it all. What happens to the man who approached you? The one with information about my family? That depends entirely on your decision. Dorian's voice remained level. Accept my arrangement and his leverage becomes worthless. I already possess what he hoped to sell, and I have no intention of using it destructively. Refuse, and you face whatever plans he had for that information without any protection. Leora stared at him, trying to see past the careful mask he wore. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to choose the devil you can negotiate with over the one you cannot. Outside, the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, a pale suggestion of light that seemed impossibly distant. Leora thought of her sister's face when she learned her education might be cut short, her mother's desperate attempts to maintain dignity while their world crumbled piece by piece. If I agreed, she said carefully, what would the terms be? 6 months initially. You would reside at Haverton House in London during the social season. Separate quarters, naturally. Your role would be that of a close family friend, someone whose presence is natural but whose attachment remains deliberately ambiguous. And the compensation? All of your family's debts resolved within the week. A private account established in your name with sufficient funds to ensure their comfort and your independence when the arrangement ends. Documentation provided to guarantee that the information currently being held over you is destroyed. It was more than generous, it was transformative. And yet Leora found herself hesitating, held back by something she couldn't quite name. You said no real attachment would form, she said finally. What makes you so certain? For the first time since their conversation began, Dorian's composure seemed to waver. Something flickered across his features. Pain, perhaps, or simply fatigue. Because, Miss Hensley, I am not capable of forming new attachments. Sarah's death saw to that. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What I'm offering you is safety in my inability to feel anything beyond the most basic human courtesy. You would be protected by my emotional limitations, not despite them. The train began to slow, and Leora realized they were approaching a station. Dawn light was growing stronger, revealing a world that looked exactly the same as it had in darkness but felt utterly transformed. I need time to consider this. Of course. Dorian reached into his jacket again and withdrew a calling card. When you've made your decision, send word to this address. If you choose to accept, a carriage will collect you within 2 days. If you choose to refuse. He paused. I would recommend leaving London very quickly. Leora took the card, her fingers brushing his briefly. His skin was warm, human, somehow surprising after their cold negotiation. And if I choose neither? If I find a third option you haven't considered? Something that might have been admiration crossed his face. Then I would be very interested to learn what that option might be, Miss Hensley. Very interested indeed. The train whistle sounded again, and the car began to fill with the sounds of passengers stirring, preparing for arrival. Dawn had come, but instead of bringing clarity, it had only illuminated how much deeper the shadows ran than she had ever imagined. The platform at King's Cross Station bustled with the controlled chaos of dawn arrival, porters wheeling luggage, passengers clutching travel cases, steam rising from the engine like the breath of some great dying beast. Leora descended from the train with legs that felt unsteady, though whether from the journey or from the conversation that had upended her understanding of her own circumstances, she couldn't say. Dorian had departed first, melting into the crowd with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to controlling his visibility. He had left her with nothing but his calling card and a decision that felt too large for her hands to hold. Now, standing on the platform with her single valise, Leora felt the weight of London pressing against her from all directions. She had enough money for 3 days at a modest boarding house. After that, her options would narrow to the sort of choices no woman should have to make. The practical voice in her head, the one that sounded disturbingly like her mother's, whispered that Dorian's offer was not just generous but necessary. The alternative was a slow-motion catastrophe that would consume her entire family. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, rebelled against the cold transaction he had proposed. To sell herself, even temporarily, even under circumstances that preserved her physical safety, it felt like a betrayal of something essential, something that once lost could never be recovered. Leora made her way through the crowded terminal, past vendors hawking morning papers and tea, past businessmen striding purposefully toward their predetermined destinies. She found a small cafe in a side street and ordered tea she couldn't afford, needing time to think without the press of strangers around her. The waitress, a woman perhaps 10 years her senior with tired eyes and capable hands, brought the tea with a sympathetic smile. Rough journey, love? Something like that. Leora wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for the simple human kindness. First time in London? No, but it might as well be. Leora looked out the window at the bustling street. Everything seems different when you're seeing it from a new perspective. The waitress nodded knowingly. That's the thing about this city. It changes depending on what you need from it. Can be cruel as winter or gentle as spring, sometimes in the same day. She paused, seeming to weigh whether to continue. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from or toward, just remember you've got more choices than you think. People in trouble sometimes forget that. After the woman moved on to other customers, Leora sat with those words echoing in her mind. More choices than you think. But what choices did she actually have? She could return home and watch her family's reputation crumble under the weight of secrets she couldn't control. She could accept Dorian's arrangement and sell her dignity for their security. Or she could find the mysterious man who had started this entire situation and confront him directly, though with what leverage she couldn't imagine. The thought struck her like lightning. She didn't need leverage. She needed information. Leora left the cafe and spent the morning walking through London's financial district, asking careful questions of clerks and secretaries. She had learned, over years of managing her family's declining finances, how to extract information without revealing why she needed it. By noon she had a name: Henry Carstairs, a man who specialized in acquiring and monetizing personal information for clients whose identities remained carefully protected. Finding his office required another hour of careful inquiry. The building was respectable but not impressive. The sort of place where questionable business could be conducted behind a veneer of legitimacy. Leora climbed 3 flights of stairs, her resolve hardening with each step. Carstairs himself was exactly what she had expected. A man of middle years whose expensive clothing couldn't quite mask the predatory calculation in his eyes. His office smelled of tobacco and old leather, and every surface was covered with carefully organized files. "Miss Hensley," he said, rising from behind his desk with a smile that never reached his eyes. "How delightful. I had wondered when you might pay me a visit. Then you know why I'm here." "I believe I do." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Leora remained standing. "I understand you have information regarding my family." Information is such a crude word. I prefer to think of it as context. Background that helps clarify certain situations. His smile widened. Situations that might be quite valuable to the right purchaser. "What do you want?" "Direct. I appreciate that in a woman." Carstairs moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. "What I want, Miss Hensley, is very simple. I want you to refuse whatever arrangement the Duke of Haverton has proposed." Leora felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "I don't understand." "Oh, but I think you do." Carstairs opened the folder, revealing photographs, documents, correspondence. "His Grace approached me several weeks ago with a most interesting proposition. He wished to acquire information about your family's circumstances, information I had already compiled for another client." "Another client?" "Someone with a very specific interest in preventing the Duke from finding a solution to his social obligations." Carstairs closed the folder with a soft snap. "You see, Miss Hensley, there are those who benefit greatly from His Grace's current availability. Political alliances, financial arrangements, marriage prospects for their own daughters. Your temporary companionship would complicate these plans considerably." Leora stared at him, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "So you approached Dorian first. You sold him the information, knowing he would use it to secure my cooperation." "Precisely. And then I informed my original client of this development, creating a most profitable situation for all concerned." His eyes gleamed. "Except, of course, for you and your family." The afternoon light slanted through the windows of Haverton House as Leora stood in the grand foyer, her single valise looking absurdly small against the marble expanse. She had sent word to Dorian that morning with a message containing only 3 words: "I accept. Conditions." The butler who had admitted her, a man whose bearing suggested he had overseen kingdoms rather than households, had informed her that His Grace would receive her in the library within the hour. The formal language, the careful distance, the precise scheduling, everything reinforced that she was entering a world where spontaneity was not merely discouraged but impossible. Now, waiting in the silence of wealth so established it had forgotten how to announce itself, Leora felt the full weight of her decision settling around her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't certain she could carry. The house itself seemed to watch her, evaluating whether she belonged within its walls or would prove to be a temporary disturbance to be endured and then forgotten. The library, when she was finally escorted to it, was exactly what she had expected. Leather-bound volumes rising to impossible heights, Persian rugs that had probably witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, and furniture that managed to be both magnificent and somehow austere. Dorian stood with his back to the door, silhouetted against tall windows that overlooked gardens manicured into geometric perfection. He turned when she entered, and she was struck again by the careful control he maintained over every aspect of his presence. Posture, expression, the measured way he moved across the room to greet her. "Miss Hensley." He offered a slight bow that somehow managed to convey both respect and emotional distance. "I confess myself surprised by your decision." "Were you?" Leora set down her valise and met his gaze directly. "After what I learned yesterday, it seemed the only reasonable choice available." Something shifted in his expression, a momentary crack in his careful composure. "What you learned?" "About Henry Carstairs. About his other clients. About the fact that this entire situation was orchestrated to put us exactly where we find ourselves now." She paused, watching his face. "You didn't know, did you?" Dorian was still for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested military training or aristocratic discipline carried to its logical extreme. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Perhaps you would share what Mr. Carstairs told you." Leora recounted her visit to the information broker's office, watching Dorian's face as she described the web of competing interests that had ensnared them both. His expression remained controlled, but she began to recognize the subtle signs of emotion beneath the surface. A slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his breathing. "I see," he said when she finished. "And what conditions did you wish to discuss?" The abrupt change of subject told her everything she needed to know about how the revelation had affected him. He was angry, not at her, but at himself for being outmaneuvered by forces he hadn't fully perceived. "First," Leora said, "I want complete transparency about the social obligations you expect me to fulfill. No surprises, no last-minute revelations about what my role will entail." "Agreed." "Second, I want access to any information you uncover about Carstairs or his clients. If I'm to play a part in their scheme, I want to understand exactly what I'm walking into." Dorian nodded slowly. "Reasonable." "Third, I want your word that when this arrangement ends, you will ensure my family's complete protection from any future attempts at manipulation or blackmail." "You have it." "And finally," Leora took a breath, knowing this condition would be the most difficult, "I want honesty between us. Not the careful, calculated version you've been offering, but actual truth. If we're to spend 6 months in each other's company, pretending an intimacy that doesn't exist, we need to understand each other as people, not as chess pieces on someone else's board." For the first time since she had entered the library, Dorian's control seemed to slip entirely. He turned back toward the windows, his shoulders tense with some emotion she couldn't identify. "Miss Hensley," he said quietly, "you may find that particular condition more challenging than you anticipate." "Because of your late wife?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dorian's reflection in the window showed a man wrestling with ghosts she couldn't see. "Because honesty requires a level of vulnerability that I am no longer capable of sustaining." He turned back to face her. "The man you see before you is not naturally cold, Miss Hensley. That coldness was acquired through necessity, maintained through discipline, and has become my most reliable defense against a world that seems determined to extract pieces of one's soul as payment for participation." The admission struck Leora as profoundly sad, not self-pitying, but weary in a way that suggested battles fought and lost in private spaces where no victory was possible. "Then we'll learn together," she said simply. "I'm not naturally calculating, Your Grace, but circumstances have taught me to be. Perhaps we can help each other remember who we were before the world required us to become who we are." Dorian stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. "Very well," he said finally. "Your conditions are accepted. Shall I have Mrs. Morrison show you to your quarters?" "In a moment." Leora picked up her valise, surprised by how light it still felt despite the weight of everything that had changed. "There's something else you should know about my conversation with Carstairs." "Yes." "He asked me to spy on you. To report on your activities, your plans, your vulnerabilities." She met his gaze directly. I thought you should know that someone considers you worth watching very carefully. Dorian's expression hardened into something that reminded her why dukes had once led armies into battle. And your response? I told him no. Leora smiled slightly. I may be many things, Your Grace, but I am not a traitor. If we're to be allies in this arrangement, then we're allies completely. The word, allies, seemed to resonate in the space between them, carrying implications neither had fully considered when they began this negotiation. Allies suggested mutual respect, shared risks, trust that went beyond mere contractual obligation. Thank you, Dorian said, and for the first time since she had met him, his voice carried genuine warmth. I believe, Miss Hensley, that this arrangement may prove more interesting than either of us anticipated. As Mrs. Morrison appeared to escort her to her quarters, Leora found herself wondering if Dorian was right. The practical part of her mind catalogued the luxury surrounding her, the security it represented, the problems it would solve. But another part, quieter but increasingly insistent, whispered that she had just committed herself to something far more complex than a simple business arrangement. She was no longer merely protecting her family's future. She was stepping into a game whose rules she was only beginning to understand, with a man whose carefully controlled exterior might be concealing depths she wasn't prepared to navigate. The casual cruelty of it took Leora's breath away. She was not a person in this equation, but a game piece to be moved across a board she couldn't even see clearly. What happens if I refuse both offers? If I simply disappear? Then the information becomes public through channels that cannot be traced back to me or my clients. Your family's reputation suffers the consequences, and everyone else proceeds with their original plans. Carstairs shrugged. Disappearing solves nothing, I'm afraid. Leora turned toward the window, looking out at the London streets where people moved purposefully about their lives, unaware of the invisible threads that connected their fates. She thought of Dorian's controlled desperation, of her own family's precarious situation, of the forces that seemed determined to use them all as instruments in someone else's composition. There is, however, a third option, Carstairs continued behind her. One that might prove beneficial to all parties. She turned back to him. Which is? Accept the Duke's arrangement. Play your role convincingly. And report to me on his activities, his plans, his vulnerabilities. The predatory smile returned. In exchange, I ensure that the information about your family never sees the light of day, regardless of what my other clients prefer. The proposal hung in the air like smoke from a poison fire. Leora understood, with crystalline clarity, that she was being asked to betray a man who had offered her protection, even if that protection came wrapped in cold practicality. You want me to spy on him? I want you to be practical, Miss Hensley. The Duke is using you for his own purposes. Why shouldn't you benefit from the arrangement as well? Leora looked at Carstairs for a long moment, memorizing his face, his posture, the casual arrogance that treated human lives as commodities to be traded. When she spoke, her voice was very calm, very clear. No, she said. I don't think I will. And without waiting for his response, she turned and walked out of his office, down the 3 flights of stairs, and into the London afternoon. Behind her, she heard him calling her name, but she didn't look back. She had found her third option after all. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, as she followed Mrs. Morrison up the grand staircase toward whatever version of herself this house would require her to become, Leora found herself anticipating the challenge with something dangerously close to excitement. The first social engagement arrived 3 days later, delivered on cream-colored paper with the Duke of Haverton's seal pressed into burgundy wax. Leora held the invitation in her morning room, a space that still felt impossibly foreign despite Mrs. Morrison's patient efforts to make her comfortable, and read the elegant script with growing apprehension. Lady Pemberton's Autumn Gathering. An intimate dinner for 30 of London's most influential families. The sort of event where reputations were made and unmade over wine that cost more than most people earned in a year. Your first test, Dorian had said when he presented the invitation that morning, his tone carefully neutral. Lady Pemberton is observant. She has made it her life's work to understand the delicate relationships that govern our social sphere. Now, as afternoon light filtered through windows that overlooked gardens she had yet to explore, Leora found herself studying her reflection in the mirror Mrs. Morrison had positioned near the window. The woman looking back wore a dress of deep blue silk that had appeared in her wardrobe as if summoned by magic. Perfectly fitted, elegantly understated, expensive enough to signal belonging without announcing newcomer status. Everything about her appearance had been carefully calculated. Her hair, arranged by a lady's maid who had worked with diplomatic precision. Her jewelry, selected from pieces that Dorian claimed had belonged to distant relatives, believable provenance for a family friend of long standing. Even her posture had been subtly adjusted through 3 days of patient coaching from Mrs. Morrison, who seemed to understand the precise angle of chin and set of shoulders that would suggest confidence without presumption. "You look as though you belong," Mrs. Morrison said, appearing in the doorway with the silent efficiency that Leora was learning to associate with the best servants. "That's half the battle won before you even enter the room. And the other half? Making them believe you choose to be there rather than need to be there." The older woman's smile held years of observation. "Desperation has a scent, Mississippi. The trick is to remember that you bring value to any room you enter, not merely receive it." Leora nodded, though her stomach remained knotted with tension she couldn't entirely dispel. She had attended social gatherings before, but never as anything more than a peripheral observer, someone whose presence was noted but not examined. Tonight she would be scrutinized, evaluated, and either accepted or rejected based on criteria she could only partially understand. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Dorian stood in the doorway, and the sight of him in full evening dress reminded her why men like him had once inspired poets and started wars. Everything about his appearance spoke of power held so naturally it required no display, from the perfect fall of his tailcoat to the way he carried himself as though the world had been constructed specifically to accommodate his presence. "The carriage is ready," he said, then paused, studying her face. "You're nervous." It wasn't a question. Leora wondered what he saw that betrayed her careful composure. "Should I not be?" Nervousness suggests you care about the outcome. In this case, that's both appropriate and dangerous. He stepped into the room and she caught the faint scent of sandalwood and something else. Leather, perhaps, or the particular smell of wealth that had been accumulating for generations. "May I offer some advice?" "Please." "Tonight, you are not Leora Hensley struggling to save her family from financial ruin. You are someone who has chosen to keep company with the Duke of Haverton because it pleases you to do so. Not because you need to. Because you wish to." Leora considered this, recognizing the wisdom in the distinction. "And if someone asks directly about my background, my family, my circumstances?" "Answer truthfully, but from a position of choice rather than desperation. Your father's investments have been challenging. That suggests a man who takes calculated risks, not a man who has failed completely. Your family values education and refinement. That suggests cultivation, not pretension." The advice made sense, but something in his tone caught her attention. "You've given this considerable thought." "I've given this considerable necessity." Dorian moved to the window, looking out at the garden where twilight was beginning to gather. "The people we'll encounter tonight are not cruel, Miss Hensley, but they are practical. They understand that their world functions according to certain rules, and they have little patience for those who threaten the stability of those rules." "And I threaten that stability?" "You represent change. A variable they haven't accounted for." He turned back to her. "That makes you either dangerous or valuable. Our task is to ensure they conclude you are valuable." The carriage ride to Lady Pemberton's residence passed in relative silence, though Leora found herself hyper-aware of Dorian's presence beside her. He had maintained the careful distance that characterized all their interactions, but in the confined space she noticed details that had previously escaped her attention. The way his hands rested perfectly still on his knees, as though movement required conscious permission. The slight line between his brows that suggested perpetual concentration. The fact that he never seemed to look directly at her for more than a few seconds at a time. "Tell me about Lady Pemberton," she said as they approached their destination. "Margaret Pemberton is 62 years old, widowed 15 years ago, and has devoted herself to maintaining what she considers the proper social order ever since." Dorian's voice carried the tone of someone reciting intelligence reports. "She dislikes pretension, values wit over beauty, and has never forgiven anyone for lying to her, even about trivial matters." "And she knows about our arrangement?" "She knows I have begun appearing in society with a companion. She will draw her own conclusions about the nature of that companionship and test those conclusions throughout the evening." The carriage stopped, and Leora heard the murmur of other arrivals, the soft sounds of wealth and privilege gathering to observe itself. Through the window, she could see Lady Pemberton's house ablaze with light, footmen moving with practiced efficiency, the sort of orchestrated perfection that required an army of invisible hands. "Miss Hensley." Dorian's voice drew her attention back to him. "There's something you should understand before we go inside." "Yes." "These people will evaluate you not just as my companion, but as a potential threat to arrangements they've spent years constructing. Marriages they've planned, alliances they've cultivated, expectations they've nurtured. His gaze finally met hers directly, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been warning or regret. They will be charming, welcoming, and utterly ruthless in their assessment. Do not mistake politeness for acceptance. The carriage door opened, and the sounds of the evening rushed in: music, laughter, the particular timbre of voices that had never known real uncertainty. Dorian stepped out first, then turned to offer her his hand. His touch, when she accepted it, was steady and warm. For a moment their eyes met, and Leora saw something pass between them, not attraction exactly but recognition. They were allies walking into battle, and whatever happened in the hours ahead would determine not just her acceptance into this world, but the nature of the alliance they had forged. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Leora straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin to the precise angle Mrs. Morrison had taught her, and smiled with confidence she almost believed. "Ready." Lady Pemberton's drawing room resembled a carefully curated museum of English aristocracy. Chippendale chairs arranged with mathematical precision, portraits of long-dead nobles watching from gilded frames, and conversation that flowed with the practiced ease of people who had been performing these social rituals since childhood. Leora entered on Dorian's arm, feeling the weight of 24 gazes assessing her from beneath polite smiles. Their hostess approached with the measured grace of someone accustomed to orchestrating such gatherings. Lady Pemberton was smaller than Leora had expected, but her presence filled the room with quiet authority. Her silver hair was arranged in a style that had probably been fashionable 30 years ago and had become timeless through sheer force of personality. "Haverton," she said, offering her hand to Dorian with genuine warmth. "How delightful to see you among the living again." The comment carried layers of meaning that Leora filed away for later examination. Dorian accepted the hand with a bow that managed to be both respectful and slightly ironic. "Lady Pemberton, thank you for including us in your gathering." "Us." The older woman's gaze shifted to Leora with the intensity of a naturalist discovering a new species. "And this must be Miss Hensley, about whom I've heard such intriguing whispers." "Lady Pemberton." Leora offered her own small curtsy, grateful for Mrs. Morrison's patient drilling in the precise angles and duration appropriate to various social situations. "Thank you for your gracious invitation." "Gracious." Lady Pemberton seemed to taste the word. How refreshingly direct. "Tell me, my dear, how do you find London society after?" She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to suggest she knew exactly where Leora had come from. "After the countryside?" The first test, Leora realized. A question designed to probe her background while offering her the opportunity to either claim status she didn't possess or reveal circumstances that would diminish her in the room's collective estimation. "I find it remarkably similar to country society actually," Leora replied, allowing a slight smile to touch her lips. "The same fundamental concerns about family, loyalty, and maintaining standards that matter. Only the scale is different." Lady Pemberton's eyebrows rose slightly. Approval or surprise, Leora couldn't tell. "Indeed. And what standards do you find most important, Miss Hensley?" "Honesty when kindness allows. Loyalty when honor permits. And the courage to choose one's associations based on respect rather than mere convenience." The answer seemed to hang in the air for a moment longer than casual conversation required. Leora became aware that nearby conversations had quieted slightly, as though the room was listening for Lady Pemberton's response. "How refreshing," their hostess said finally. "Haverton, you've brought us someone with actual opinions. How unusual." The comment drew a ripple of polite laughter from the surrounding guests, and Leora felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. She had passed the first examination, though she suspected the evening would offer many more. Dinner was announced, and the company moved toward the dining room with the complex choreography of precedence and protocol. Dorian offered his arm again, and as they processed toward their seats, he spoke quietly near her ear. "Well done. She likes you." "How can you tell?" "She called you refreshing." For Margaret Pemberton, that's practically a declaration of undying devotion. Leora found herself seated between an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Sir William Hartley and a younger woman whose elaborate coiffure and nervous energy suggested she was recently married and still learning to navigate these social waters. Across the table, she could observe Dorian engaged in conversation with a stern-faced woman who seemed to be interrogating him about agricultural policies. "Miss Hensley," Sir William said as the first course was served, "I understand you're a particular friend of Haverton's family." Another probe, this one delivered with the casual air of someone making pleasant dinner conversation. Leora had been prepared for this line of inquiry. "Our families have been acquainted for some years," she replied truthfully. I've always found the Duke's perspective on various matters quite valuable. Various matters? Sir William repeated with a slight smile. How diplomatically put. And what brings you to London at this particular time? The opportunity to renew old friendships and perhaps form new ones. Leora met his gaze directly. I find that isolation, while sometimes necessary, can become limiting if maintained too long. The young woman beside her, Lady Catherine something, Leora thought, leaned forward with bright curiosity. How exciting. I remember my first season, the absolute terror of not knowing anyone. You're so brave to venture out again after. She stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. After my period of mourning, Leora said gently, recognizing an opportunity to establish a narrative that would explain any unfamiliarity with current social dynamics. It's been quite an adjustment. The explanation drew sympathetic murmurs from those near enough to hear. Mourning was something this society understood, a legitimate reason for temporary withdrawal from social life, and a respectable motivation for returning to it gradually. As the evening progressed, Leora found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the conversation, the careful dance of revealing just enough personal information to seem genuine while maintaining the mystery that would make her interesting. She spoke of books she had read, places she had visited, opinions she held on matters of no great political consequence. Each exchange felt like a small negotiation, testing the boundaries of what was acceptable while establishing her right to occupy space in their world. It was during the fourth course that she noticed the shift in Dorian's demeanor. He had been maintaining his usual composed participation in the dinner conversation, but something, a comment perhaps or a particular look from one of the other guests, had caused his careful mask to slip slightly. She caught his eye across the table and saw something there that made her stomach tighten with concern. The woman beside him, whom Leora had identified as the formidable Duchess of Marlborough, was speaking in low, urgent tones that suggested more than casual dinner conversation. Whatever she was saying was causing Dorian visible discomfort, though his responses remained controlled and polite. Miss Hensley, Lady Pemberton's voice drew her attention back to her immediate surroundings. I was just telling Sir William about your family's connection to the Westmere lineage. Such an old association, isn't it? The question felt like walking across ice that might crack at any moment. Leora didn't know what story had been established about her family's connection to Dorian's, and improvising could prove disastrous. Old associations often prove the most enduring, she said carefully. Families that have weathered various seasons together tend to understand each other in ways that newer connections cannot. Indeed, Lady Pemberton agreed, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was filing away every word for later analysis. And how do you find Haverton changed since his return to society? He's been quite selective in his social engagements these past years. Leora glanced again at Dorian, who was still locked in what appeared to be an increasingly tense conversation with the Duchess. Whatever was being discussed was causing him to employ the kind of rigid control she had learned to associate with moments when his composure was most threatened. I think, she said slowly, choosing each word with care, that grief teaches us to value authenticity over convenience. Perhaps what appears to be selectivity is simply a clearer understanding of what truly matters. The comment seemed to land with unexpected weight. Lady Pemberton's expression shifted to something approaching respect, and Sir William nodded approvingly. But it was the sudden silence from Dorian's end of the table that told Leora her words had carried further than she intended. When she looked at him, she found his attention fully focused on her, his expression unreadable but intense. The Duchess beside him had stopped speaking, apparently recognizing that she had lost her audience entirely. In that moment, Leora realized that something fundamental had shifted. She had spoken not as someone playing a role, but as someone defending a man she was beginning to understand. And from the way the room seemed to hold its breath, everyone present had recognized the change. The evening was far from over, but already it had become something neither she nor Dorian had anticipated when they climbed into the carriage just hours earlier. The carriage ride home passed in loaded silence. Dorian stared out the window at the darkened London streets, his profile sharp against the passing gaslight, while Leora sat with her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. The evening had ended cordially enough. Polite farewells, gracious thanks, the subtle nods of approval that suggested she had passed whatever tests Lady Pemberton's gathering had presented. But something had shifted during that dinner conversation, and the man beside her had retreated behind walls that seemed higher and more impenetrable than ever. The Duchess of Marlborough seemed particularly interested in your plans, Leora ventured as they turned into the quiet streets near Haverton House. The Duchess of Marlborough has particular interests in many things that don't concern her. His voice was clipped, controlled in a way that suggested considerable effort. Including your social obligations? Dorian's laugh was short and entirely without humor. The Duchess has a daughter. Lady Elizabeth. 22 years old, impeccable bloodlines, adequate fortune, and the sort of decorative accomplishments that make her suitable for permanent arrangements. The euphemism hung between them like a blade. Leora understood suddenly what conversation she had witnessed across the dinner table. Not casual social discourse, but a negotiation. The Duchess pressing for consideration of her daughter, using whatever leverage she possessed to advance the match. I see, Leora said quietly. And what was your response? The same response I've given to 17 similar approaches over the past 3 years. Dorian finally turned from the window to look at her. That my circumstances don't currently permit such considerations. 17. Leora couldn't hide her surprise. Marriage, Miss Hensley, is rarely about personal preference in our sphere. It's about alliances, consolidation of resources, the perpetuation of influence across generations. His voice carried a weariness that suggested these were battles fought repeatedly. My continued unmarried state represents instability, uncertainty, resources that remain uncommitted. The carriage stopped before Haverton House, but neither of them moved to alight. In the confined space, Leora could see the exhaustion that Dorian kept carefully hidden from the world, not physical fatigue, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been defending the same position for too long. What did you tell the Duchess about Lady Elizabeth? That my current arrangements preclude immediate consideration of new attachments. His gaze met hers with something that might have been apology or warning. I allowed her to draw her own conclusions about what those arrangements might entail. Understanding struck Leora with uncomfortable clarity. You implied that our association was. I implied nothing directly. But I allowed inference to flourish. Dorian's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his jaw. It was expedient. The word stung more than Leora expected. She understood the practical necessity of what he had done, but being reduced to expediency, even for strategic purposes, felt like a small violation. I see, she said again, though her tone had cooled considerably. Miss Hensley. Dorian's voice carried a note of urgency that surprised her. You must understand. I understand perfectly. Leora reached for the carriage door handle. I'm a convenient shield against unwanted attention. Nothing more, nothing less. That's not. Dorian stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that seemed almost helpless. It's not as simple as that. Isn't it? Leora paused in opening the door. You've purchased my temporary companionship to deflect social pressure. Tonight, you used the implication of that companionship to discourage the Duchess's matrimonial ambitions. It seems quite straightforward from where I sit. The silence that followed was different from their earlier quiet, charged with something that felt dangerously close to actual emotion rather than mere social tension. You defended me tonight, Dorian said finally, his voice so low she almost didn't catch the words. I beg your pardon? At dinner. When Lady Pemberton questioned my social selectivity. Your response. He paused, seeming to search for words. You spoke as though you believed what you were saying. As though my choices were worthy of defense rather than merely convenient for your purposes. Leora studied his face in the dim light filtering through the carriage windows. Something in his expression reminded her of a man discovering he was not, after all, completely alone in a hostile territory. Perhaps I did, she said quietly. Why? The question was asked with such genuine bewilderment that Leora felt something shift inside her chest. Not the careful sympathy she had maintained for his circumstances, but something more personal, more dangerous. Because, she said, choosing her words carefully, having spent 3 days in your household, having observed how you treat your servants, how you conduct your business, how you've honored every commitment you've made to me, I've begun to suspect that your grief hasn't made you cold, Your Grace. It's made you careful. And there's a difference. Dorian stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something crack in his carefully constructed defenses. Not dramatically, not with the sort of emotional display that novels favored, but quietly, like ice beginning to thin under spring warmth. Miss Hensley. He began then stopped. When he continued, his voice carried a quality she had never heard from him before, uncertainty. I fear I may have misrepresented the nature of this arrangement. Both to you and to myself. How so? I told myself and you that I was incapable of forming new attachments. That my emotional limitations would protect us both from complications. His hands, which had been perfectly still throughout their conversation, finally moved, a slight, unconscious gesture toward her before falling back to his lap. I'm beginning to suspect I was wrong. The admission hung between them like a confession in a cathedral. Intimate, dangerous, impossible to take back. Leora felt her heart begin to beat faster, though whether from excitement or alarm she couldn't say. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that somewhere between your refusal to be intimidated by Carstairs and your defense of my character to Lady Pemberton, this has stopped feeling like a business arrangement. Dorian's voice was barely above a whisper. And I'm telling you that I don't know what to do with that realization. Leora looked at him, really looked, and saw not the controlled duke who had negotiated her temporary companionship, but a man who was discovering that his heart had not died with his wife after all. The vulnerability in his expression was almost painful to witness. What do you want to do with it? She asked softly. I want. He paused, and she could see him wrestling with desires he had apparently convinced himself no longer existed. I want to know if what I think I see in your eyes when you look at me is real, or merely another role you're playing for my benefit. The question struck her like a physical blow, not because it was cruel but because it was so achingly honest. She realized that he was as confused by the change in their dynamic as she was, as unprepared for the possibility that their careful arrangement might be transforming into something neither of them had bargained for. It's real, she whispered, and felt the last pretense of purely practical association crumble between them. The carriage door opened, startling them both. The footman stood waiting with professional patience, apparently unaware that he had interrupted a moment that would reshape everything that came after. Dorian recovered first, stepping out and offering his hand to help her alight. But when their fingers touched, neither of them moved immediately. They stood on the steps of Haverton House, hands joined, looking at each other with the recognition that they had just crossed a line they hadn't even realized they were approaching. Miss Hensley, Dorian said formally, though his voice shook slightly. Your Grace, she replied with equal formality. But nothing about the moment felt formal at all. It felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that the next step would either be flight or falling, and being unable to predict which one they would choose. The morning brought rain that drummed against the windows of Haverton House with the persistence of an unwelcome truth. Leora sat in her private parlor, ostensibly reading correspondence but actually staring at the same paragraph for the third time, her mind replaying every word of the previous evening's carriage conversation. The admission that had passed between her and Dorian felt too large for the elegant room to contain, too dangerous to examine directly in daylight. A soft knock interrupted her circular thoughts. Mrs. Morrison entered with the morning's post and the particular expression she wore when delivering information that required careful handling. His Grace requests your presence in the study when convenient, miss, she said, setting down the silver tray with letters that Leora recognized as responses to social invitations. He mentioned it was regarding your social calendar. The pause before social calendar suggested Mrs. Morrison understood more about the household's complex dynamics than she ever explicitly acknowledged. Leora wondered how much the servants observed, how much they discussed in the invisible network of communication that kept great houses functioning. Of course. I'll go immediately. The study was smaller than the library, more intimate. A room designed for actual work rather than impressive display. Dorian stood behind his desk, but instead of his usual controlled composure, there was something restless in his posture, as though he had been pacing before her arrival. Morning light revealed details she had missed in the carriage's shadows. The slight shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he had slept poorly, the way his usually perfect cravat sat just slightly askew. Miss Hensley. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, but something in his manner suggested this was not the formal meeting the setting implied. Thank you for coming so promptly. Mrs. Morrison mentioned something about social obligations? Yes. Dorian lifted a cream-colored card from his desk. We've received an invitation that requires discussion. The Earl of Whitmore is hosting his annual autumn ball. 300 guests, including virtually everyone who shapes political and social opinion in London. Leora accepted the invitation, noting the weight of the paper, the engraved coat of arms, the formal script that managed to convey both celebration and command. It seems quite grand. It's the social event of the season. Refusing would be, noted. Attending. He paused and she could see him choosing his words carefully. Attending together would make a particular statement about the nature of our association. What sort of statement? Dorian moved to the window, putting the width of the room between them. At Lady Pemberton's dinner, we were observed by 30 people. Speculation about our relationship could be dismissed as curiosity about a new acquaintance. But Whitmore's ball? He turned back to her. At Whitmore's ball, we would be seen by everyone who matters in English society. Dancing together, dining together, presenting ourselves as a committed partnership. The words hung in the air with the weight of a proposal that was not quite a proposal. Leora understood what he was asking. Would she be willing to step fully into the role of his companion, knowing that doing so would cement her position in his life and make any future separation more complicated? And after last night's conversation, she said carefully, you're wondering if such an appearance would be wise. I'm wondering if it would be fair. Dorian's voice carried a note of self-recrimination that surprised her. To either of us. Leora set down the invitation and studied his face, trying to read the emotions he was working so hard to contain. You think it would be a mistake. I think it would be dangerous. He returned to his chair but didn't sit, instead gripping the back as though it were an anchor. Miss Hensley, Leora, what I told you last night changes everything about this arrangement. The practical distance we maintained, the clear boundaries we established. None of that exists anymore. The use of her given name struck her with unexpected force. In 3 weeks of careful formality, he had never abandoned the Miss Hensley that maintained proper distance between them. Hearing her name in his voice, spoken with quiet intensity, felt like an intimacy she hadn't expected to want. So you're suggesting we don't attend? I'm suggesting we consider what we're truly choosing. Dorian finally sat, his careful control slipping enough to reveal the man beneath the title. If we appear together at Whitmore's ball, London society will draw conclusions. Those conclusions will become expectations. And expectations create obligations, Leora finished. I understand. Do you? The question was asked with surprising urgency. Because I'm not certain I do. 3 days ago, I knew exactly what this arrangement was and what it would accomplish. Now, he gestured helplessly. Now I find myself caring more about your comfort than my convenience. More about your reputation than my social obligations. And I don't know what to do with that realization. Leora felt something tender and terrifying unfurl in her chest. This was not the composed Duke who had negotiated her temporary companionship on a night train. This was a man discovering that his heart had betrayed his careful plans, and the vulnerability in his admission was almost overwhelming. What do you want to do? She asked, echoing his question from the carriage. I want to attend the ball with you. The words came out in a rush as though he was afraid he would lose courage if he hesitated. I want to dance with you, dine with you, present you to society as someone who matters to me. Not because it's convenient or strategic, but because it's true. And what frightens you about that? Dorian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands where they rested on the desk. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Everything. He looked up, and she saw pain in his eyes that went beyond their current situation. When Sarah died, I thought the part of me capable of connection died with her. These past 3 years, I've built my life around that assumption. Arranged my obligations, structured my relationships, planned my future based on the certainty that I would never again feel. What? Hope. The word seemed to cost him everything to speak. I never expected to hope for anything beyond duty and survival again. But sitting in that carriage last night looking at you, I felt. He stopped, shaking his head. I felt possibility. And that terrifies me more than any social scandal or political complication ever could. Leora rose from her chair and moved around the desk, not stopping until she stood close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his breathing had become carefully controlled. This close, she could smell the sandalwood that seemed to be his signature scent, could see the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed how much this conversation was costing him. Dorian, she said softly, using his name for the first time. What if we stopped trying to predict the future and simply chose what we wanted for one evening? He looked up at her with something approaching wonder. You would do that? Risk your reputation, your position, everything you've gained here for one evening of uncertainty? I would do that, she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing, for the chance to discover what us might mean when it's not constrained by contracts and careful distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Dorian reached out, his fingers barely brushing hers, a touch so light it might have been accidental, except for the way his eyes never left her face. The ball is in 5 days, he said quietly. Then we have 5 days to decide who we want to be when we walk into that ballroom together. And if we discover we've made a mistake? Leora smiled, feeling a recklessness that was entirely new to her careful nature. Then we'll make it together and deal with the consequences together. But at least we'll know. Dorian's answering smile was small but real, the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him. You realize this is madness. Complete madness, she agreed. Shall we be mad together? His fingers closed more firmly around hers, and in that simple contact, Leora felt the last pretense of their practical arrangement dissolve completely. Whatever they were becoming had moved far beyond the realm of business transactions or social convenience. They were falling, and neither of them was quite ready to spread their wings. The dressmaker's shop on Bond Street occupied 3 floors of Georgian elegance, its windows displaying silks and satins arranged with the artistry of a museum exhibition. Leora stood before a triple mirror while Madame Dubois, a formidable Frenchwoman with the bearing of a general commanding an army of seamstresses, circled her like a predator assessing prey. Non, 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 Madame Dubois declared, dismissing the third gown with a wave that managed to convey both artistic passion and commercial disdain. This will not do at all. For Whitmore's ball, for Z Duke of Alverton's companion, we need something that speaks, that sings, that makes every other woman in Z room wish she had stayed home. Mrs. Morrison, who had accompanied Leora on this expedition with the grimly determined air of someone executing a military campaign, consulted her notes with professional efficiency. His Grace was quite specific about the impression to be made. The reminder of Dorian's involvement in even this intimate aspect of her preparation sent an unexpected flutter through Leora's chest. 2 days had passed since their conversation in his study, and the careful distance they had maintained was dissolving by degrees. He had begun joining her for breakfast, their discussions ranging from politics to literature with an ease that felt dangerously natural. Yesterday she had found him in the garden, staring at the roses with an expression so lost she had approached without thinking, placing her hand briefly on his arm before they both realized what she had done. The touch had lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but the awareness it created seemed to linger in every subsequent interaction. Now, standing in her chemise while Madame Dubois considered her like a canvas awaiting the perfect artistic vision, Leora found herself wondering what Dorian had imagined when he instructed the dressmaker to create something extraordinary. Ah, Madame Dubois said suddenly, her eyes lighting with inspiration. Ave Z perfect thing. Marie. Bring Z midnight blue, Z1 with Z silver thread work. The dress that emerged from the back room seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a creation in deep blue silk that appeared almost black until the fabric moved, revealing undertones that shifted like shadows on water. The bodice was cut with mathematical precision, the skirt designed to move like liquid around the wearer. Silver embroidery traced delicate patterns across the fabric, subtle enough to suggest rather than announce wealth. This, Madame Dubois announced with satisfaction, this will make him remember why he is alive. The comment struck closer to home than Leora expected. She thought of Dorian's admission that he had felt hope for the first time in 3 years, of the way he looked at her now with something approaching wonder, as though she were a miracle he hadn't dared to expect. The fitting required an hour of careful adjustments, pins and measurements, and the peculiar intimacy of being transformed by expert hands into someone who belonged in ballrooms and drawing rooms and the sorts of places where history was quietly made. When Madame Dubois finally stepped back with an expression of artistic satisfaction, Leora barely recognized herself in the mirror. The woman looking back wore elegance like armor, confidence like jewelry. The deep blue made her skin luminous, the cut of the bodice suggesting rather than revealing, the fall of the skirt creating an impression of movement even in stillness. She looked like someone who could stand beside a duke and belong there not through sufferance but through right. Magnifique, Madame Dubois breathed. "Zay Duke, he has excellent taste in women, non?" Mrs. Morrison cleared her throat delicately. "The accessories, madam." His Grace mentioned jewelry. "Ah oui." The dressmaker produced a velvet case containing a necklace of such understated perfection that Leora's breath caught. Sapphires and diamonds arranged in a pattern that seemed to capture starlight, the setting clearly antique but timeless. "This belonged to Z previous Duchess, I believe. His Grace, he wishes you to wear jewels." The significance of the gesture struck Leora like a physical blow. She was not merely borrowing jewelry for appearance's sake, she was being offered pieces that had belonged to Sarah, Dorian's late wife. The intimacy of it, the trust it represented, felt almost overwhelming. Are you certain?" she whispered. Mrs. Morrison's expression softened with something that might have been understanding. "His Grace was most specific, Mississippi," he said. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. He said the jewels had been waiting for someone worthy to wear them again. The necklace felt warm against Leora's skin as Madame Dubois fastened it, the weight of sapphires and diamonds nothing compared to the weight of what they represented. In the mirror she saw not just a woman prepared for a ball, but someone who had been granted permission to step into spaces previously reserved for another. The carriage ride back to Haverton House passed in contemplative silence. Leora found herself touching the necklace through the tissue paper in which it had been carefully wrapped, thinking about the woman who had worn it before her. What had Sarah been like? Had she loved Dorian with the fierce devotion that still seemed to surround him like armor? Had she understood that her death would leave him so thoroughly shattered that 3 years later, he would still speak of himself as broken? Mrs. Morrison, as if reading her thoughts, spoke quietly from the opposite seat. She was very kind, the late Duchess. Gentle in ways that made everyone around her want to be better than they were. You knew her well? I was her lady's maid before I became housekeeper. She had a way of seeing the best in people, of making them believe they were capable of more than they thought. Mrs. Morrison's voice carried the weight of genuine grief. His Grace, he adored her. Completely. When she died, it was as though half of him went with her. The revelation explained so much about Dorian's careful emotional distance, his conviction that he was incapable of new attachments. If he had loved his wife with such completeness that her loss had nearly destroyed him, no wonder he had built walls to prevent such vulnerability again. Do you think? Leora began, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase the question that had been haunting her. Do I think he's capable of loving again? Mrs. Morrison's perceptive guess was delivered with the gentle directness that Leora had come to appreciate. I think, miss, that His Grace is discovering that the heart has a greater capacity for renewal than he believed possible. The question is whether he'll have the courage to trust it. The carriage turned into the drive of Haverton House, and Leora saw Dorian standing at the entrance, apparently having been watching for their return. The sight of him waiting for her sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, not the careful attraction she had acknowledged but something deeper, more dangerous. As she alighted from the carriage, dress box and jewelry case in hand, she saw his gaze take in the parcels with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Successful expedition? He asked, offering his arm to escort her inside. I believe Madame Dubois has outdone herself, Leora replied, acutely aware of his proximity, of the way his attention seemed focused entirely on her despite the bustle of servants managing packages and arrangements. I have no doubt. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made her look at him more closely. Leora, about the necklace. If it makes you uncomfortable, if the associations are too. It doesn't, she interrupted gently. It's beautiful. She had exquisite taste. Something shifted in Dorian's expression, not quite relief, but a loosening of tension she hadn't realized he was carrying. She did. About many things. The comment carried layers of meaning that Leora was still learning to interpret. As they climbed the stairs together, her hand resting lightly on his arm, she found herself wondering if Sarah would have approved of what was happening between them, or if her ghost would always stand between them like a reminder of what complete love looked like. 3 days until the ball. 3 days to discover whether the hope growing between them was strong enough to overcome the shadows of the past, or whether they were building something beautiful on a foundation too fragile to sustain the weight of their expectations. The night of the Whitmore ball arrived with unseasonable warmth that carried the scent of late roses through the open windows of Haverton House. Leora stood in her chambers, watching her reflection as her lady's maid, a young woman named Agnes who had been specifically assigned to her for the evening, made final adjustments to the midnight blue gown that had been transformed from beautiful to breathtaking through careful pressing and arrangement. The sapphire necklace lay cool against her throat, its weight a constant reminder of the trust Dorian had placed in her. Her hair had been arranged in a style that was both elegant and slightly unconventional, gathered at the nape of her neck with tendrils left to frame her face, creating an effect that was sophisticated without being severe. Agnes had applied cosmetics with such skill that Leora appeared to be wearing none at all, though her eyes seemed larger, her lips fuller, her complexion luminous with health and anticipation. You look like a duchess yourself, miss, Agnes said with shy admiration. His Grace won't know what hit him. The comment drew a smile from Leora, though it also intensified the nervous energy that had been building throughout the day. This evening would be their public debut as something more than convenient companions, and the thought of presenting themselves to the scrutiny of London's elite while still uncertain of what they meant to each other felt like attempting to dance on a tightrope stretched over an abyss. A soft knock interrupted her preparations. Mrs. Morrison entered with her usual efficiency, carrying an additional jewelry case that she set carefully on the dressing table. "His Grace's compliments, miss," she said, opening the case to reveal sapphire earrings that perfectly complemented the necklace. He thought these might complete the ensemble. But it was the note tucked inside the lid that drew Leora's attention, heavy paper bearing Dorian's distinctive handwriting. "For courage should you need it, and for beauty though you require no enhancement. D." The simple message carried more weight than any elaborate declaration could have managed. Leora touched the note gently, recognizing it as the sort of gesture that revealed character. Thoughtful without being presumptuous, supportive without being patronizing. "Shall I help you with the earrings, miss?" Agnes asked. As the sapphire settled against her neck, catching the lamplight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes, Leora felt the final transformation complete. The woman in the mirror was someone who belonged in ballrooms, someone who could stand beside a duke and claim her place through confidence rather than sufferance. "His Grace is waiting in the main hall," Mrs. Morrison announced as Agnes gathered the discarded tissue and empty boxes. "He asked that I escort you down when you were ready." The walk through Haverton House felt different than it ever had before, not the tentative movement of a guest unsure of her welcome, but the sure steps of someone who had found her place within these walls. Servants she passed offered small nods of approval or acknowledgement that suggested her acceptance had extended throughout the household. At the top of the grand staircase, Leora paused. Below, Dorian stood in the black and white perfection of full evening dress, but it was his expression when he looked up and saw her that stopped her breath entirely. The careful control he maintained so religiously simply vanished, replaced by something so raw and wondering that she felt her heart stutter in response. He didn't move as she descended the stairs, but his gaze never left her face, and she could see him absorbing every detail of her appearance with the intensity of someone memorizing something precious. By the time she reached the bottom of the staircase, the air between them seemed charged with electricity. "Miss Hensley," he said formally, but his voice was rough around the edges. Then more quietly, "Leora, you're—" He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to what he was feeling. "You're extraordinary. Thank you." The simple response felt inadequate, but the way he was looking at her, as though she were something miraculous he hadn't dared to hope for, made more elaborate speech impossible. Dorian offered his arm, and when she took it, she felt the slight tremor in his muscles that suggested he was not as composed as he appeared. "Are you ready?" "Are you?" she countered, recognizing that he was as affected by the evening's significance as she was. His smile was small but genuine, the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him all day. "No. But I find I no longer care about being ready. I only care about going forward." The carriage ride to the Earl of Whitmore's residence passed in comfortable silence, though Leora was acutely aware of Dorian beside her, the way he kept glancing at her as though assuring himself she was real, the careful way he had arranged himself to avoid crushing her skirts, the fact that his breathing seemed slightly unsteady. As they approached their destination, the magnitude of what they were undertaking became evident. The Earl's mansion blazed with light from every window, and the street was crowded with carriages depositing guests whose names regularly appeared in both social columns and parliamentary debates. This was not merely a party but a display of power, influence, and social hierarchy made visible. "Second thoughts?" Dorian asked quietly as their carriage joined the queue. "Third and fourth thoughts," Leora admitted, but no desire to turn back. "Good." His hand covered hers briefly, the contact warm and reassuring. "Because I find myself wanting to show you off to everyone who matters in England, and that impulse is both deeply unfamiliar and surprisingly powerful." The admission sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with social triumph and everything to do with the quiet wonder in his voice when he spoke of wanting to claim her publicly. Their carriage reached the entrance, and Leora could hear the murmur of conversation from within the house, hundreds of voices blending into the particular sound of wealth and influence celebrating itself. A footman opened the carriage door, and Dorian stepped out first before turning to help her alight. The moment her foot touched the ground, Leora felt the weight of observation settle around her like a cloak. Other guests were watching with the practiced assessment of people accustomed to evaluating newcomers for signs of belonging or pretension. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin to the precise angle Mrs. Morrison had taught her, and placed her hand on Dorian's arm with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there. "Together?" Dorian asked quietly as they approached the entrance. "Together," she confirmed. And hand in hand, they walked into the glittering heart of London society to discover what they might become when the careful barriers between them finally fell away completely. The ballroom stretched before them like a scene from a fairy tale, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across polished floors, flowers arranged in displays that suggested entire gardens had been sacrificed for beauty, and 300 of England's most powerful people arranged in careful clusters that spoke of alliances and rivalries invisible to outsiders. But Leora barely noticed the splendor. Her attention was focused entirely on the man beside her and the way his hand had settled possessively over hers on his arm, as though he was finally ready to claim what he wanted instead of merely protecting what he had already lost. The Earl of Whitmore received them in a receiving line that moved with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed theatrical production. Lord Whitmore himself, a portly man whose shrewd eyes suggested a mind far sharper than his jovial manner indicated, greeted Dorian with the familiarity of old political alliance. "Haverton. Delighted you could join us. And this must be the mysterious Miss Hensley we've been hearing whispers about." His bow to Leora was perfectly calibrated, respectful without being deferential, acknowledging her presence without committing to any particular interpretation of her relationship with Dorian. "Lord Whitmore," Leora responded with the careful courtesy she had practiced. "Thank you for including me in such a magnificent celebration. The pleasure is entirely mine, my dear. Any friend of Haverton's." He let the sentence trail meaningfully before turning his attention back to Dorian. "I trust we'll have opportunity to discuss the railway bill later this evening? Some interesting developments in committee." "Of course." Dorian's response was automatic, but Leora noticed his attention was already moving beyond their host to assess the room beyond. "If you'll excuse us?" As they moved into the main ballroom, Leora felt the weight of collective observation settle around them like a physical presence. Conversations continued, but with the slightly artificial quality of people speaking while simultaneously evaluating the new arrivals. She could sense assessments being made, conclusions being drawn, the subtle recalibration of social dynamics that occurred whenever an established figure appeared with an unexpected companion. "Breathe," Dorian murmured near her ear, his voice so low only she could hear. "You belong here as much as anyone else in this room." The reassurance was more necessary than she had expected. Despite all her preparation, the reality of being scrutinized by 300 people who wielded influence like a weapon was overwhelming. But Dorian's presence beside her, solid and unwavering, provided an anchor she hadn't realized she would need. "Your Grace." A woman's voice interrupted her thoughts, and Leora turned to see Lady Pemberton approaching with the measured grace that had made her such a formidable social force. Tonight, their former hostess wore burgundy silk and an expression of keen interest that suggested she was here on reconnaissance as much as celebration. "Lady Pemberton." Dorian bowed with precisely the correct degree of respect. "How delightful to see you again. You remember Miss Hensley?" "Indeed." Lady Pemberton's gaze moved over Leora with the thoroughness of an art appraiser evaluating a potential acquisition. "My dear, you look absolutely radiant tonight. That gown is exquisite. Worth?" "Madame Du Bois," Leora replied, grateful for the neutral territory of fashion discussion. "Ah, even better. She has such an eye for bringing out individual character rather than merely following trends." Lady Pemberton's approval seemed genuine. "And those sapphires, family pieces?" The question carried more weight than casual jewelry appreciation. Leora felt Dorian's attention sharpen beside her, recognizing that they had reached one of those moments where social maneuvering became as delicate as diplomatic negotiation. "A loan from His Grace," Leora said carefully. "Far too precious for me to own, but he was kind enough to allow me to borrow them for the evening." It was a truthful answer that nevertheless deflected the deeper implications of Dorian allowing her to wear what had clearly been his wife's jewelry. But Lady Pemberton's expression suggested she understood exactly what was not being said. "How generous," she murmured, then turned to Dorian with a smile that managed to be both warm and calculating. "You must bring Miss Hensley to my Tuesday salon, Haverton. I have several people who would find her perspectives quite refreshing." The invitation was clearly a mark of preliminary acceptance, but it also felt like a summons for further evaluation. Leora was beginning to understand that London society operated like an elaborate court system, with Lady Pemberton serving as something approaching a Chief Justice who determined social verdicts through careful observation and strategic invitation. "We would be honored," Dorian replied, and Leora noticed his use of "we" with something approaching relief. Whatever uncertainty he had felt about claiming their association publicly seemed to be dissolving under the pressure of actual social interaction. As Lady Pemberton moved on to other conversations, other evaluations, Dorian guided Leora toward the edge of the ballroom where they could observe the complex choreography of elite social interaction without being immediately accessible to every curious observer. "Well," he asked quietly. How does it feel to pass Lady Pemberton's initial inspection? Terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, Leora admitted. Does she always evaluate people so thoroughly? Always. But the fact that she issued a further invitation suggests you've met whatever standards she was applying. Dorian paused, his gaze moving across the ballroom with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to reading social currents. There's something else you should know about tonight. The shift in his tone drew her complete attention. What? The Duchess of Marlborough is here. With Lady Elizabeth. He nodded toward a cluster of guests near the orchestra, where Leora could see the formidable woman from Lady Pemberton's dinner standing beside a young woman whose beauty was as conventional as it was undeniable. They will almost certainly approach us at some point this evening, and the conversation will be loaded with subtext. Leora studied the mother and daughter, noting the way they moved through the crowd with the confidence of people accustomed to being courted rather than having to court others. Lady Elizabeth was everything Leora was not. Blonde where she was brunette, delicately formed where she was more substantially built, clearly bred from birth for exactly this sort of social environment. What kind of subtext? The kind where the Duchess attempts to determine whether you represent a temporary obstacle to her plans or a permanent redirection of them. Dorian's voice carried a note of grim anticipation. She is not a woman who accepts defeat gracefully, and your presence here tonight will be interpreted as a direct challenge to arrangements she has been cultivating for months. The warning should have intimidated Leora, but instead she felt a spark of something that might have been anticipation. She had survived Henry Carstairs, Lady Pemberton's evaluation, and the general scrutiny of London's elite. The prospect of a more direct confrontation with someone who saw her as competition felt almost refreshing in its clarity. Then perhaps, she said with a smile that surprised them both with its confidence, it's time to make that challenge explicit. Dorian's expression shifted to something approaching admiration mixed with concern. Leora. You said you wanted to show me off to everyone who matters in England, she reminded him. I believe the Duchess of Marlborough qualifies as someone who matters. She does. But she's also someone who can make life extremely difficult for people who thwart her expectations. Then we'll have to ensure she understands that her expectations are no longer relevant. Leora straightened her shoulders and turned to face him fully. Dorian, are we going to spend this evening apologizing for what we might be becoming, or are we going to embrace it and let the consequences sort themselves out? The question hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. For a moment, Dorian simply stared at her, and she could see him wrestling with 3 years of careful emotional protection against the growing certainty that she was worth the risk of vulnerability. You realize, he said finally, that embracing this publicly will make retreat much more difficult if we discover we've misjudged what we're feeling? Yes. And that the social consequences of a public association that ends badly could follow you for years? Yes. And that I am probably the worst possible choice for someone seeking uncomplicated affection, given my history of loving so completely that loss nearly destroyed me? Leora reached up and touched his cheek gently, her fingers tracing the line of tension along his jaw. Around them, the ballroom continued its elaborate dance, but in that moment she could see only him. Dorian, she said softly, I'm not seeking uncomplicated affection. I'm seeking you. All of you, including the parts that are damaged and careful and afraid. If that's dangerous, then we'll be dangerous together. For a heartbeat, the careful Duke vanished entirely, replaced by a man looking at the possibility of salvation he hadn't believed could exist. Then the orchestra struck up a waltz, and he offered his hand with a smile that was part invitation, part surrender. Then shall we dance, Miss Hensley, and let London society draw whatever conclusions it pleases? I thought you'd never ask, Your Grace. And as they moved onto the dance floor together, Leora felt the last pretense of their practical arrangement dissolve completely. Whatever they were becoming had moved far beyond the realm of contracts or social convenience. They were falling in love in front of 300 witnesses, and neither of them cared who was watching. Dancing with Dorian felt like discovering a language she had always known but never spoken. His hand at her waist was firm and sure, guiding her through the intricate steps of the waltz with an expertise that spoke of years of practice, but it was the way he looked at her, as though she were the only person in a ballroom filled with 300 others, that made her breath catch in her throat. You dance beautifully, he murmured as they turned in perfect synchronization with the music. I had excellent instruction, she replied, thinking of the dancing master her father had hired during better times, when such accomplishments had seemed like investments in a future that would include advantageous marriages and social prominence. Did you? There was something in Dorian's voice that suggested he was thinking of more than dancing lessons. And what other excellent instruction have you received that I should know about? The question was asked lightly, but Leora sensed a deeper curiosity beneath it, the desire to understand how she had acquired the skills that allowed her to move so comfortably in his world. French, Italian, watercolors, and enough classical literature to hold my own in intellectual conversation, she said with slight irony. The complete education of a gentleman's daughter designed to make her attractive to men of substance and refinement. And yet here you are, dancing with a man who hired your companionship rather than courting it properly. The comment carried a note of self-recrimination that surprised her. Here I am, she agreed, dancing with a man who is discovering that what began as practical arrangement has become something neither of us expected. Dorian's step faltered almost imperceptibly, and she realized her words had struck deeper than intended. When he looked at her again, his expression carried a vulnerability that made her heart constrict. What are we doing, Leora? The question was asked so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the music, but the weight of genuine uncertainty in his voice was unmistakable. Here, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, surrounded by the elite of London society, he was asking her to define what they were becoming. We're dancing, she said gently. And we're allowing ourselves to feel what we're feeling without trying to control or predict or protect against it. And what are you feeling? The directness of the question took her breath away. They were still moving through the steps of the waltz, still maintaining the appearance of polite social interaction, but the conversation had become so intimate it felt almost inappropriate to be having it in public. I'm feeling, she said carefully, as though I'm falling in love with a man who has convinced himself he's incapable of loving again. And I'm terrified and exhilarated and completely certain that I don't want to be anywhere else. Dorian's hand tightened on hers, and for a moment she thought he might stop dancing entirely. The music swirled around them, other couples moved past them in carefully orchestrated patterns, but in the space between them something fundamental shifted. Leora. He began, then stopped as though the words he wanted were too dangerous to speak aloud. I know, she said softly. I know you're not ready to say it back. I know you're still protecting yourself against the possibility of loss. I know this is terrifying for you in ways I can't completely understand. But I also know that what I see in your eyes when you look at me is real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this easier for either of us. The waltz was ending, the music building toward its final crescendo, but neither of them seemed aware of anything except each other. As the last notes faded and polite applause rippled through the ballroom, they remained motionless, hands still joined, caught in a moment of recognition that felt too large for the elegant setting to contain. Your Grace. A cool, measured voice interrupted their tableau, and Leora turned to see the Duchess of Marlborough approaching with Lady Elizabeth in tow. The older woman's smile was perfectly calibrated, socially appropriate while managing to convey subtle disapproval. How lovely to see you enjoying the evening's entertainment. Dorian recovered his composure with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating social warfare. Duchess. Lady Elizabeth. May I present Miss Hensley? Leora offered the precise curtsy appropriate to the difference in their ranks, but she kept her chin up and her gaze direct. If this was to be a battle, she had no intention of beginning from a position of submission. Miss Hensley. The Duchess's acknowledgement was correct but cool. I don't believe we've been introduced, though I've heard such interesting things about you. All favorable, I hope, Leora replied with a smile that matched the Duchess's own measured politeness. Oh, quite fascinating actually. Such an unusual situation, a young lady appearing in society under such distinctive circumstances. The barb was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Leora felt Dorian tense beside her, but she placed a subtle hand on his arm to forestall whatever intervention he might be contemplating. This was her battle to fight. I find that distinctive circumstances often lead to the most rewarding associations, she said pleasantly. Don't you agree, Your Grace? After all, conventional arrangements can become so predictable. Lady Elizabeth, who had been silent through this exchange, stepped forward with a shy smile that seemed genuine despite the awkwardness of the situation. Miss Hensley, your gown is absolutely beautiful. Is that Madame Du Bois's work? The younger woman's attempt to redirect the conversation toward safer territory was both kind and telling. Leora found herself liking Lady Elizabeth despite the complicated circumstances, recognizing in her the sort of gentle nature that was often sacrificed to ambitious parents' social maneuvering. Thank you, Lady Elizabeth. Yes, Madame Du Bois has quite extraordinary skill. Your dress is lovely as well, the rose color is particularly flattering. You're too kind. Lady Elizabeth's blush suggested she was not accustomed to receiving compliments from women she had been taught to consider rivals. "I was just telling Mama how much I admired your necklace during dinner. Such beautiful sapphires." The comment drew immediate attention from the Duchess, whose gaze fixed on the jewelry with the intensity of someone recognizing significant detail. Leora could practically see her drawing conclusions about what it meant for Dorian to loan family pieces to his companion. "Family jewels can be such treasures," the Duchess said with deceptive casualness. "So full of history and sentiment. I imagine they're particularly meaningful when shared with special friends." The emphasis on special friends was subtle but unmistakable. The Duchess was probing for information about the exact nature of Leora's relationship with Dorian, testing whether this was a temporary liaison or something more serious. "I feel quite honored to wear them," Leora replied, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "His Grace has been extraordinarily generous in sharing so many treasures. His library, his conversation, his insights into matters of importance. I find myself learning something new every day about the depth of his generosity." The response was carefully crafted to suggest intimacy without being explicitly improper, while making it clear that her access to Dorian extended far beyond mere social companionship. The Duchess's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, recognition of a more formidable opponent than she had initially anticipated. "How charming," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And are you planning to remain in London for the remainder of the season, Miss Hensley?" "That depends," Leora replied, glancing at Dorian with a look that suggested shared decisions and mutual consideration, "on how events develop. I find that the best plans are often those that remain flexible." It was a declaration of war delivered with perfect social courtesy, and everyone present understood it as such. The Duchess's carefully laid plans for her daughter were being challenged by someone who refused to be intimidated or dismissed. "Indeed," the Duchess said coolly. "How modern of you. Come, Elizabeth. I believe Lord Pemberton was hoping to secure a dance with you this evening." As mother and daughter moved away, Lady Elizabeth cast a backward glance that seemed to carry both apology and something approaching relief. Leora found herself wondering if the young woman had been as reluctant a participant in her mother's matrimonial schemes as Dorian had been in receiving them. "That," Dorian said quietly once they were alone again, "was magnificently done." Was it? Leora felt suddenly uncertain now that the confrontation was over. "I may have made a powerful enemy. You made it clear that you're not someone who can be easily dismissed or maneuvered around. That was necessary." His voice carried a note of admiration that warmed her more than any elaborate compliment could have managed. "But you're right about making an enemy. The Duchess doesn't forgive challenges to her authority easily. Then we'll have to ensure that this challenge becomes permanent victory rather than temporary defiance." Dorian looked at her with an expression that mixed wonder and something approaching reverence. "You realize what you're committing to? Taking on the Duchess of Marlborough and her allies is not a minor social skirmish. This is declaring war on one of the most powerful women in English society." "Then it's fortunate," Leora said with a confidence that surprised them both, "that I have an excellent ally in that war." The orchestra struck up another waltz, and Dorian extended his hand with a smile that was pure invitation to conspiracy. "Shall we give them something more to talk about, Miss Hensley?" "Always, Your Grace." And as they moved back onto the dance floor, Leora felt the exhilarating certainty that they had just crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. Whatever they were becoming it publicly, boldly, and with full knowledge of the consequences. They were no longer falling in love in secret. They were claiming each other in front of witnesses, and letting the world arrange itself around that reality however it chose. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, conversations, and dances that felt like a carefully choreographed campaign. Word of the confrontation with the Duchess of Marlborough spread through the ballroom with the efficiency of wildfire, and Leora found herself the subject of intense scrutiny that went far beyond mere social curiosity. She was being evaluated as a player in the complex game of influence and alliance that constituted London's elite society. Some of the attention was friendly. Lady Pemberton made a point of introducing her to several influential women whose nods of approval suggested provisional acceptance. Others were more calculating, the sort of assessment that measured her potential usefulness in future social maneuvering. But most significant were the conversations that didn't happen, the slight hesitations, the polite but distant acknowledgments that indicated some members of society were waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing to any particular opinion of her status. Through it all, Dorian remained at her side with a consistency that spoke louder than any formal declaration. He danced with her twice more, a frequency that bordered on the scandalous and certainly suggested serious attachment. He included her in political conversations with men whose decisions shaped parliamentary policy. Most tellingly, he introduced her not as his guest but as Miss Hensley, allowing others to draw their own conclusions about her permanent presence in his life. By the time they joined the queue for their carriage at evening's end, Leora felt as though she had undergone some fundamental transformation. The woman who had entered the ballroom was someone playing a role. The woman leaving had claimed that role as her own and made it part of her identity. "Tired?" Dorian asked as they settled into their carriage for the ride home. "Exhilarated," she replied honestly. "Terrified, overwhelmed, and completely unable to regret a single moment of it." "Even the encounter with the Duchess?" "Especially the encounter with the Duchess." Leora arranged her skirts carefully to avoid crushing them during the ride. "She needed to understand that I'm not someone who can be intimidated into withdrawing gracefully. Now she does." Dorian was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the darkened streets passing outside their window. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality she hadn't heard before, something between admiration and concern. "You realize what you've done tonight, don't you? You've essentially declared yourself my Duchess in all but name. In front of witnesses who will spread that interpretation throughout society by tomorrow afternoon." The weight of his words settled around her like a cloak. She had been so focused on the immediate challenge of the Duchess's subtle attacks that she hadn't fully considered the broader implications of her responses. "Are you regretting that?" she asked quietly. "No." The answer came without hesitation, but then he turned to look at her directly. "But I need you to understand what it means. After tonight, London society will expect either a formal announcement of our engagement or a scandal when one doesn't materialize. There's no middle ground anymore." Leora felt her heart begin to race, though whether from excitement or terror she couldn't say. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that if you wake up tomorrow and decide this has all been a beautiful mistake, the consequences will follow you for years. Marriage to me or social ruin. Those are the only options society will accept after the show we put on tonight." The stark ultimatum should have frightened her, but instead Leora felt a strange sense of clarity settling over her thoughts. All evening she had been operating on instinct and emotion, reacting to challenges and opportunities as they arose. Now, faced with the necessity of conscious choice, she discovered her feelings were far more settled than she had realized. "Dorian," she said carefully, "are you asking me to marry you or warning me against it?" His laugh was short and entirely without humor. "I'm doing both simultaneously, which I realize is neither fair nor coherent." He ran a hand through his hair in the gesture she had learned to associate with moments when his careful control was most strained. 3 weeks ago, I was certain I would never marry again. Tonight, I found myself introducing you to society in ways that made my intentions embarrassingly clear, and I don't entirely understand how that happened. Perhaps it happened because you're not as incapable of new attachments as you believed. Perhaps. Or perhaps I'm simply making the same mistake twice, allowing my heart to override my judgment and assuming that intensity of feeling guarantees permanent happiness. The reference to his first marriage hung between them like a ghost suddenly made visible. Leora realized they had been dancing around the shadow of Sarah's memory all evening, but this was the first time Dorian had acknowledged directly how his grief was coloring his perception of their relationship. "What happened with Sarah wasn't a mistake," she said gently. "From everything I've heard, it was a great love that ended too soon. That's tragedy, not error in judgment. Isn't it?" Dorian's voice carried a bitterness that surprised her. "I loved her so completely that her death nearly destroyed me. I spent 3 years convinced that the intensity of that loss proved the depth of what we shared. But tonight, dancing with you, I found myself wondering if what I called love was actually obsession, possessiveness, the need to control and contain rather than cherish and release." The admission was clearly costing him everything to speak aloud. Leora could see the pain in his expression, the guilt of a man questioning feelings he had held sacred for years. "Why would you think that?" "Because loving you feels completely different." The words came out in a rush as though he was afraid he would lose courage if he hesitated. "With Sarah, I felt the constant need to protect, to shield, to ensure her happiness at the expense of everything else. With you." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "With you, I find myself wanting to discover what you're capable of when you're completely free to be yourself. Tonight, watching you face down the Duchess, I felt proud rather than protective. Admiration rather than anxiety." Leora stared at him, trying to process what he was telling her. "You think loving me is healthier than loving her was?" "I think loving you is teaching me that there are different ways to love someone. That caring for another person doesn't require losing yourself in their needs. Dorian looked at her with an expression that was part wonder, part confusion. And that terrifies me almost as much as it exhilarates me, because I don't know what to do with love that doesn't consume everything else in my life. The carriage had stopped moving, and Leora realized they had reached Haverton House without her noticing. Through the windows, she could see the familiar facade lit by gaslight, looking exactly as it had when she first arrived but somehow transformed by everything that had changed between them. "What do you want to do with it?" she asked, echoing the question that had become their refrain. Dorian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face as though memorizing every detail. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to marry you. Not because society expects it, not because it's convenient, not because I've backed us into a corner where it's the only respectable option. I want to marry you because I've discovered that the part of me I thought died with Sarah was only sleeping, and you've awakened it into something stronger and healthier than I believed possible." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an abyss, beautiful, fragile, requiring faith to cross. Leora felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming rightness of what he was offering. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. Yes, I want to marry you. For all the same reasons and because I've fallen in love with both the man you are and the man you're becoming." She reached for his hands, finding them warm and slightly trembling. "And because after tonight, I can't imagine being anyone else but the woman who stands beside you and claims her place in the world through her own strength." Dorian's response was to lean forward and kiss her with a tenderness that carried the weight of promise, of commitment, of a future neither of them had dared to imagine just hours before. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Well then," he said softly, "I suppose we'll have to make this official. I suppose we will. Tomorrow? Tonight felt rather official to me." His laugh was warm and genuine, free of the careful control that usually characterized his expressions of amusement. Tonight was the declaration. Tomorrow we make it legal. And as they finally alighted from the carriage and walked together into Haverton House, not as duke and paid companion, not as convenient arrangement, but as a man and woman who had chosen each other freely and completely, Leora felt the last piece of her old life fall away. She was going to be a duchess. More importantly, she was going to be Dorian's duchess, and that felt like coming home to a place she had never known she was searching for. 6 months later. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the breakfast room at Haverton House, casting golden squares across the polished mahogany table where the Duke and Duchess of Haverton sat reading their correspondence over coffee and eggs. To any observer, they might have appeared to be a couple settled into the comfortable routines of established marriage, but the frequency with which their eyes met over the morning papers, the way Dorian's hand would brush Leora's as he passed her the sugar, suggested a relationship still crackling with the electricity of new love. "The Times has a rather flattering account of your speech to the Ladies' Charitable Foundation," Dorian said, looking up from the newspaper with an expression of unmistakable pride. "They're calling you a duchess for the modern age." Leora smiled, remembering the nervous energy she had felt standing before an audience of London's most influential women, arguing for education reform with a passion that had surprised even her. 3 months into her marriage, she had discovered that being a duchess provided a platform for advocacy she had never imagined possible. "Lady Pemberton deserves most of the credit," she replied, though her pleasure in the recognition was evident. "She's the one who suggested I channel my strong opinions into something constructive." "Your strong opinions," Dorian repeated with amusement, "have become one of your most attractive qualities. Though I admit I'm still recovering from watching you reduce Lord Ashford to stammering agreement about factory working conditions." The reference made Leora laugh, remembering the stuffy parliamentarian who had made the mistake of dismissing her concerns as feminine sentiment during a dinner party the previous week. By the evening's end, he had found himself agreeing to tour several factories with her to see conditions firsthand. "Poor man never knew what hit him," she said with satisfaction. "I don't think any of us did." Dorian set down his paper and reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her wedding ring. "Have I mentioned recently that marrying you was the most intelligent decision I've ever made? Only every morning for the past 3 months. But Leora's smile took any sting out of the teasing. "Though I notice you've stopped looking surprised when you say it." "I've stopped being surprised by it." "That's different." His expression grew more serious, carrying the weight of genuine reflection. I spent so long convinced that what Sarah and I had was the only way I could love someone that I nearly missed recognizing something completely different but equally real. They had talked often about his first marriage in the months since their wedding, working through the guilt and confusion that had initially colored Dorian's feelings about their relationship. Through those conversations, Leora had come to understand that his love for Sarah hadn't been diminished by loving her. It had been transformed into something that honored the past while embracing the future. Different but equally real, she repeated thoughtfully. I like that description. Do you? Because I have something I want to show you that I think you'll find different but equally meaningful. The shift in his tone drew her complete attention. Over the months of their marriage, she had learned to recognize when Dorian was building toward something significant. What sort of something? Instead of answering directly, he rose from his chair and offered her his hand. Come with me. Curious and slightly apprehensive, Leora allowed him to lead her from the breakfast room, through the familiar corridors of Haverton House, and up the stairs toward the family portrait gallery. But instead of stopping at the main collection, he guided her to a smaller alcove she had never explored, where morning light fell across a single painting that had been recently hung. The portrait showed a woman in the same midnight blue gown Leora had worn to the Whitmore ball, the sapphire necklace glowing against her throat, but it was not merely a formal duchess's portrait. The artist had captured something in her expression. Confidence, warmth, the slight smile that suggested she was about to say something either very wise or mildly scandalous. It was recognizably her, but elevated into something timeless. Dorian, she breathed, stepping closer to examine the extraordinary detail. When did you? How did you? I commissioned it the week after the ball, he said quietly. Based on how you looked that night when you faced down the Duchess of Marlborough and claimed your place in society through sheer force of will. I wanted to capture that moment when you stopped being my companion and became yourself. The painting hung beside another portrait, Sarah in soft pastels surrounded by roses, captured in a moment of gentle laughter that spoke of private joy and protected happiness. The two women could not have been more different in style or presentation, yet somehow they belonged together in this space, representing different chapters of the same man's capacity for love. She's beautiful, Leora said softly, studying her predecessor's portrait with the careful appreciation of someone no longer threatened by comparison. She was. And she would have liked you enormously. Dorian moved to stand beside her, his gaze moving between the two paintings. I used to think having both portraits here would feel wrong, like I was trying to hold on to the past and embrace the future simultaneously. But now it feels like the most honest representation of who I am. A man who has been blessed with two great loves that have shaped him in completely different but equally important ways. Leora leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the security of a love that had grown stronger rather than dimmer with familiarity. Through the windows of the gallery she could see the gardens of Haverton House, where new plantings were beginning to bloom alongside established roses, creating something that honored tradition while embracing change. I have news, she said quietly, suddenly certain this was the perfect moment to share what she had discovered just that morning. Oh. Mrs. Morrison was right about the signs she thought she was noticing. Leora turned in his arms so she could see his face when understanding dawned. It seems the Haverton line will continue after all. For a moment, Dorian simply stared at her, processing what she was telling him. Then his face transformed with a joy so complete and unguarded that she felt tears prick at her eyes in response. Are you certain? As certain as one can be at this stage. The doctor will confirm it next week, but... She placed his hand gently against her still flat stomach. I'm quite sure. Dorian's kiss was reverent, grateful, full of wonder at the miracle of new life and new possibilities. When they finally broke apart, he kept his forehead pressed against hers, his breathing unsteady with emotion. A child? He whispered. Our child. Are you pleased? Pleased? Leora, He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to what he was feeling. I'm terrified and exhilarated and grateful beyond measure. I'm everything I was when I first realized I was falling in love with you, multiplied by the magnitude of creating a life with you. Then we're perfectly matched, she said with a smile. Because that's exactly how I feel too. They stood together in the portrait gallery, surrounded by the visual history of the Haverton family, adding their own chapter to a story that stretched back generations and would continue long after they were gone. But in that moment, the future felt less important than the present. Two people who had found each other against considerable odds, who had built something beautiful from the ruins of grief and the courage to hope again. Outside, London continued its relentless pace, Society continued its complex dances of influence and alliance, and the world continued to change in ways both subtle and dramatic. But inside Haverton House, in the quiet sanctuary of their love, the Duke and Duchess of Haverton held each other and marveled at the unexpected gifts that life could offer to those brave enough to remain open to them. "I love you," Dorian said softly, the words carrying the weight of promise, gratitude, and absolute certainty. "I love you too," Leora replied, and felt the future unfold before them like a story waiting to be written. The portrait artist had captured her in the moment she claimed her place in society, but this, standing in her husband's arms, carrying their child, surrounded by the love they had built together from hope and courage and the determination to trust each other completely, this was the moment she truly became the Duchess of Haverton. Not through title or ceremony or social recognition, but through the quiet miracle of two hearts that had learned to beat in rhythm with each other, creating something beautiful enough to last a lifetime. The end.